And this really brings us to the second of the principles, is that the ego itself is a fiction created in the mind by circular patterns of thinking based on separation. So the ego is a fiction in the mind. What does that mean? That the ego is basically our sense of self and the thoughts and ideas and beliefs that circle around that sense of self that go into deriving a bigger, more conceptualized version of ourself. In other words, who we think and imagine ourselves to be. And who we think and imagine ourselves to be is something that's created in the mind. And as I said, most human beings are completely identified with this image they have of themselves that is in the mind. And then that image they have of themselves, which is ultimately nothing but a circular pattern of thinking based in separation, that self or that ego is always trying to find peace, find happiness, and it is often unsatisfied with the peace that it's able to find, because any peace, any happiness that the ego finds is relatively short-lived and it's fleeting. So when we come to see, and this is a very, very important thing to examine, to really look into your whole sense of your identity, whatever that identity is, and to start to see that one's entire identity is based on patterns of thinking that are circular, which means they just repeat over and over and over and over again, and that those patterns of thinking are based in separation. In other words, the assumption that human beings make is that they are a separate, individual entity, that I am something ultimately separate and distinct from you and from the world around me. That's the either conscious or unconscious conclusion of the ego, that it exists in this immensity of life, and it is separate from that immensity, and on some level finds that immensity frightening and threatening. And yet the ego is looking towards life and everyone in life to try to make it happy. So our egos are always trying to find happiness where they can't be found. One can't find true, lasting happiness outside of themselves. Whatever happiness you find outside of yourself can be taken away. And in time, it will be taken away, because the nature of everything that exists, everything you can observe, everything that is around you, is that it is impermanent. This is something the Buddha told us over 2,500 years ago, that all phenomena are impermanent. They come and they go. And so when we begin to really examine how our sense of self is created, to really look at this nature of how ego gets created, is very, very powerful and very, very important to do. And as I said, at least in a very basic way, ego is a creation of the mind. So who you think you are is just that. It is who you think you are. It is who you have been taught to believe that you are. It's a conglomeration of beliefs about yourself, ideas, opinions, judgments, all the ways that the mind keeps thinking about a self, thinking a separate self into existence. Now, for some people, this comes as a surprise. For some people watching this video with me, they've never even considered that their true nature, who and what they really are, who and what you really are, is not something you can ever find in your mind. What you think about yourself, what you think about others, what you think about the world, is just that. It's thinking. And this addiction to thinking, this addiction to being attached, and even more than attached, identified with thinking, is a very deep and profound cause of suffering. But since your own being lies at the center of your own awareness, this is the place to begin. To not look for something outside of yourself, not look for peace or freedom or even spiritual awakening as something out there, something other than right within your own being. And not to assume that you know who and what you are. This is the most important step, is we have to have this willingness to question, to have an openness that maybe that who and what you are really isn't who and what you are. People involved in a spiritual path often create spiritual egos. And the spiritual ego is basically a spiritual seeker. And that spiritual ego or spiritual seeker is concerned with what it's seeking, whether it's seeking for God or for enlightenment or for happiness, self-realization or peace or God. But when the ego structure takes on a spiritual image of itself, and then we become a spiritual person or a spiritual personality, and then we are a seeker. As soon as we become a seeker, we've identified with seeking thoughts, with circular patterns of thinking that tell us that we need to seek something, that we need to attain something in order to be happy and in order to be free. So the second real principle of this teaching is that the ego is a fiction created by the mind, created by circular patterns of thinking that are based in the belief, the assumption that you are separate, separate from existence, separate from God, separate from peace and happiness and love. That these are things that you need to attain. This belief in ego is the great cause of conflict and suffering. And it's the primary illusion that spirituality really is meant to dispel. Spirituality is a teaching which offers you the possibility of breaking free of this egoic state of consciousness and coming into a whole new realization of who and what you truly are. But all this starts with the willingness to question, to pause for just a moment, and to realize that maybe you aren't who you think you are, aren't who you imagine yourself to be. Whether you think of yourself as good or bad, worthy or unworthy, spiritual or unspiritual, a seeker or a non-seeker, no matter how you define yourself, that any sense of separation is a fiction. To have enough curiosity to start to question your deepest identity is absolutely vital and essential to spiritual awakening and to the realization of peace and freedom.